Hey all, thank you for joining us and welcome to Us in Flux Conversations from the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. My name is Bob Beard and I'm project manager at the center where we use the tools of speculative fiction to get people thinking more optimistically about the future. And Us in Flux is our response to these strange times we're living in. Every week we publish a short story that explores the themes of community, collaboration, and collective imagination in response to transformative events. And then we host a panel discussion to go deeper on these topics. And we've got a great panel lined up this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you're joining from. So feel free to pose questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll spend a little bit of time chatting, and then we'll move on to those questions throughout the conversation. Our latest story for Us in Flux was published last Thursday. When We Call a Place Home is a piece from Chinelo Onwualu. Chinelo is a writer, editor, journalist, and communications consultant. She's the founder of Omenana, a magazine of African speculative fiction, and the former chief spokesperson for the African Speculative Fiction Society. Her writing has been featured in Slate, Uncanny, Strange Horizons, the Kalahari Review, and Brittle Paper. We're going to talk more about her piece for Us in Flux in just a bit, but it's an incredible story and we've been thrilled to watch it develop. If you've already read the story, you might recognize that it has some surprising resonances with a real-world community in Northeast Syria. To help us understand these connections, we chatted with Mr. Robert Evans. Robert is the author of A Brief History of Vice, an investigative journalist for Bellingcat, and the host of the podcast Behind the Bastards and co-host of Worst Year Ever, both for iHeartMedia. Over the course of his career, he's reported from war zones in Iraq, Ukraine, Northeast Syria, and his most recent work is The Women's War, a documentary series about the feminist anti-authoritarian revolution in Rojava. So thank you both for being here, and thank you all for watching. So we're gonna get started. First of all, I think it might just be great to hear a little bit about your story, Chinelo. So can you talk a little bit about the story and its influences?
So the story has been with me maybe about a year. It was actually the structure, I think, for it was inspired by a dream I had, which is a lot of my stories. But for a long time, I have been thinking about what happens in the wake of a society's collapse. What do people do when all the structures around them start to fall apart? So the narrative that we tend to hear is sort of the Walking Dead narrative, I like to call it, because it's the idea of if the strictures of capitalist society, loosen or fall apart, we're just going to go crazy. We're going to start eating each other. There will be, war in the streets. And I started questioning that narrative a long time ago. I started asking whether whose fears are we being exposed to when we see these kinds of narratives come up over and over and over again. Who stands to lose the most in such a situation? And so the story sort of came about with me thinking about what does a society that isn't based on any of these structures or hierarchies that we are used to or that we assume are inevitable? What happens if we build a society without the hierarchy of gender? What happens if we build a society without even the concept of hierarchy? And I found that when we try to imagine speculative futures or speculative worlds, secondary worlds, we have a really, 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 really hard time getting away from these. Instead, we take the hierarchies that we already see in the world and we superimpose them into our own imagination. So you still have these utopic societies where it is clear that there is still a racial hierarchy, or you might not even have, people of color in your future at all. Or you might have a future where all the women are wearing miniskirts because that's the future, and these biases continue to replicate. So what I was interested in doing was finding a way to tell a story about collapse that didn't inevitably lead to chaos, and about rebuilding and reconstruction that didn't inevitably lead to inequity. And it was surprisingly difficult. And so I think when when we came across Robert's work, it was really eye-opening to think that someone or a group of people had in the real world tried to make this happen and were surprisingly successful. Like, it wasn't some commune in the middle of California that collapsed after a few years. This was like an ongoing societal experiment that seemed to be working, and that was fascinating to me.
That's excellent. Thank you for that. So Robert, we touched on it a little bit, but can you talk a little bit about the experiment in Rojava?
Yeah, I mean, essentially what happened is that starting in about 2012, when the Syrian revolution or civil war, whatever you want to call it, kicked off against the dictator Bashar al-Assad, there were large chunks of the country that were up openly in arms. And then there were chunks in the country where there was some fighting intermittently in northeast Syria, but kind of more than anything, the government found itself just sort of pulling out. And so the people there wound up kind of realizing that there was no longer much in the way of state power. And eventually there was nothing in the way of state power there. And this was at the same time that ISIS started to grow like a cancer over the whole region. So kind of simultaneously, the government's gone, and there's this new and even somehow more malevolent force moving against us. And the only real organized military force in the region was a group called the PKK, which is a Kurdish insurgent group fighting a guerrilla war against the Turkish government that has a lot of bases in Syria and Iraq, which is kind of right across the way from them. And the only real organized political force was the PYD, which was originally kind of a quasi-Marxist insurgent political party in the area. And they both subscribed to the ideas of their founder, a guy named Abdullah Öcalan. And Öcalan was a longtime insurgent who started out as, again, like a Marxist-Leninist, and then after being imprisoned in 1999, came across the writing of an American anarchist thinker named Murray Bookchin, who was this guy who lived, I think, in Vermont, and wrote all these different theories about how a post-capitalist society might actually work, and kind of named the idea libertarian municipalism. And Bookchin was actually kind of trying to solve what he saw is the problems that are now cropping up in the United States that we're all kind of increasingly aware of, the fact that like people in rural areas have fundamentally different needs and wants from their society than people in urban areas. And our system basically just allows one group to kind of oppress the other every 4 to 8 years. So Bookchin was looking at that, and he was also looking at the growing problem of climate change. He wrote a book in 1965, really lucidly outlining what was going to happen, what has happened over the last couple of decades that we're all living through now. And so he looked at both of these issues and he tried to solve it in the United States. And he came up with this political system, libertarian municipalism. And Abdullah Öcalan, on an island prison in Turkey, came across one of this guy's books and decided, oh, this is great. And so he started adapting that into his thinking. And at the same time, he was reading a lot of like Neolithic archaeological journals and anthropological journals. And he also came to this belief that the fundamental core of all authoritarianism, not just in Turkey or in Syria, but in the world, was the domination of women by men. And so he came to these beliefs that, like, number one, he had this idea for a system that he thought might work better than the systems that were currently being tried. And he came to the conclusion that if he was going to push for a revolution, the first revolution he needed to push for was one of radical gender equality. And so through this kind of like series of almost baffling coincidences, this wound up being the dominant ideology of the most powerful armed group opposing ISIS in this chunk of Syria. And over the course of 5 or 6 years of really brutal combat, they beat back ISIS, and they started experimenting with this system in a region of about 3 to 4 million people. And they've been living under that system ever since. It's a pretty amazing story.
Yeah. So because this idea has been with you for a while, this idea for your story, Chinelo, what was it about the real life situation? What sort of things that are happening in Rojava, what sort of models help you to fully realize the world of the story?
So what I think really struck me about learning about Rojava was that it was so practical. I had a lot of trouble figuring out how, in practical terms, a society based on, principles of radical feminism, of benign anarchies without hierarchies would actually practically function. And I I attribute that to the fact that it's never been something I've ever actually seen. Maybe in the closest that I could find was maybe the radical benign anarchies of the 12-step programs, and to see that someone had done this in the real world at scale. So I work with a lot of NGOs, a lot of nonprofits, and what we tend to do is have these little micro pilot programs that go in, implement something in a small community or a village, and then that's it. It almost never goes anywhere, and it certainly never gets replicated to the state level or to the local government level or even to the national level. So to see that this group had taken this opportunity to do this, and the fact that their commitment to feminism was part of their core belief, I don't know that I'd ever seen that before. And that just blew my mind, to be honest. That really just got me, it gave me a sense of radical hope that I don't know that I have any other sort of revolutionary ideal has kind of given me. And it made me think, even if what I'm writing is fiction, the fact that someone out there has taken that fiction and tried to make it into something real, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah.
It is. Yeah. So, I mean, this is a utopian story. When we call a place home is, a utopian story, which is a whole different mode of storytelling. And, thinking about some of the best known utopian literature, The Dispossessed comes to mind, of course, Star Trek, even something like Demolition Man. How do you think utopian stories can be helpful? So I have a two-part question, but how do we think that utopian stories can be helpful? And that's for the both of you.
I think utopian stories are incredibly important because they reshape the landscape of our imagination. We like to think that imagination is this vast, endless plane where anything is possible. But the truth is, we are very much limited by the things that we can make possible, even in our own minds. And we are all the result of social conditioning. So all of us have experienced systems in which there is some sort of form of domination. And so when you try to think about a system without domination of any kind, it can be impossible. And I think what utopias can do is tell us, is move the thing that is impossible into the possible, and do so in a way that allows us to then build upon it. So if you have, it took a lot of literature that posited worlds without slavery for then real life abolitionist movements to then kind of take over and try to bring those worlds into reality. It takes positing a world without sexism to then inspire people to want to make that real. Philosophy is really good at that, but I think speculative fiction is powerful because it taps into the hunger for story that I think is part of the human psyche. So, when we have like Star Trek, I think, is a great example of this because it posits a society without capitalism. And I think for many people, that is something impossible to imagine right now. I mean, maybe it's growing more possible, but for a long time, it didn't seem like we could ever live in a society without money. And so something like that, something as small as that, can really have like wide-ranging impacts, I think.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think that imagining utopia or even just imagining a better future is kind of an act of radical self-defense in a way. And that's the way, we've been talking about Star Trek, so a good way to look at Star Trek is the reaction of, I think, a very sensitive individual to the Cold War, and to kind of the hopelessness and the almost inevitability of annihilation that was in the air for a lot of people at that time. And it was an act of self-defense to imagine a future in which fundamentally mankind had gotten past that, had gotten past the things that Roddenberry kind of saw in the world around him that seemed most toxic and hopeless. So he envisioned, Russians and Americans working together. He envisioned a post-racial society. And it's kind of depressing to me that we seem to have lost the ability to imagine utopia, at least in popular culture, right? You can find stuff that's kind of less mainstream that proposes these kinds of worlds. But if you look at sort of the things that are successful in our society media-wise, even Star Trek has turned into a bit of a dystopia. And I think that says a lot about where we are right now. And I think we fundamentally need utopian visions as a species if we're going to survive. If we can't imagine, if all we can imagine is collapse, then that's the only thing we're capable of.
Yeah. So building on that, I told you it was a two-parter. What are some of the features of utopian stories that are prioritized in experimental communities? Rojava is but one, right? There's also Exarchia in Greece and Maranletta in Spain. Like, what are they using? What sort of features of utopias are they using to build their societies?
I mean, I think one thing that you see is a focus towards community-oriented problem solving and direct action. So one of the things that I find most toxic about the United States, which is the culture I've grown up in, and the culture, one of the things I find most toxic about life here right now is the kind of learned helplessness that is pushed on the average citizen. And we don't phrase it as helplessness. Like we actually often phrase it as democracy, but the idea that like the only difference you can make is by voting once every 2 to 4 years. There's actually a profound kind of hopelessness in that, especially when you or the whatever you believe like loses an electoral cycle. And so I think one of the primary things that I see in these kind of utopian projects is a push away from that, a push away from anything that involves like term limits or annual elections or anything like that, because it suggests a kind of hopelessness in between those periods of voting. And getting away from this idea that that's how we ought to organize ourselves, and towards this idea that if we're going to make things better, that involves people taking actions every single day, direct physical actions in their world and their community around them to improve material circumstances for themselves and their neighbors. I think fundamentally, like that's the essence of utopia to me, because it involves an empowering of the individual. And that's a big part of what I saw when I was in Rojava, was a reorganization of society from what had been a very top-down dictatorial state, Syria, to a bottom-up, you have these local communes where everyone who lives in the area is a member, and they vote and take action directly and form committees and handle the critical aspects of day-to-day decision-making for themselves. And so you had these cases where older women who had lived their whole lives, didn't know how to read, had never really been educated, had never thought that they would be able to take a role of leadership in their community, were suddenly taking on jobs that we would consider like kind of the jobs of law enforcement in the United States, dealing with domestic disturbances, violence, like problems of local order in order to set their community to rights. And not just sort of, going around and helping people talk through disputes, but also at times carrying guns and taking the self-defense of themselves and their neighbors into their own hands. And there was a kind of almost intoxicating sense of potential that came with that, because you got to feel what it feels like when people who have never had a sense of their own power suddenly feel that for the first time. And it's like nothing else I've experienced. I guess that's kind of the core of what is utopianism to me.
I agree. I think that one thing that when we are given the chance to sort of organize ourselves, and I think Rebecca Solnit's book Paradise in Hell sort of talks about this, where once formal governance structures that are often very top down, very authoritarian or dictatorial break down, the first thing you see, the ways that people organize, is into these self-selected cells that are communitarian, that are more communal, that are much more based on need and communication. And I think that's the way that, to be honest, I think that there's something about the human psyche that thrives in that. And when we formalize it and make it into these more, one leader talking to the many structures, we lose something really, really important. And I don't think it's an accident that whenever we think of communities that nurture us, or spaces that nurture us, we don't think of hierarchical structures that require somebody to be below somebody else. That's just not something that we gravitate to, I think, as a species. And so, and so when we think about what is the worst thing that could happen, when we think about our dystopias, they're always authoritarian. They're always, hierarchical. They're always oppressive. And that tells us what it is, I think, that that makes us thrive or helps us thrive. Yeah.
So there's a question in the Q&A, and thank you for submitting questions, and continue to do so through the conversation. But Simone asks if utopias can also be dangerous. They don't all come from participatory, liberatory backgrounds or ideologies. So I wondered if you might speak to that. And thanks for that question.
I think that brings in the question of bias, right? And we all have our biases. We all have our perspectives. So if I were coming to a utopia, and I think Star Trek is a really great example of this, Gene Roddenberry was a straight white male, and he had these things that he wanted to focus and highlight when he created his utopia. But there were other things that it simply didn't occur to him as being something that would need reform. So in his utopia, it was still a captain at the top who was giving orders to a crew at the bottom. And these were not spaces that were necessarily particularly nurturing. They weren't spaces that were, there was a lot of baked in sexism into his worlds. There was a lot of unexamined racism in his world. And it still required, the idea of the nation state was still a big thing, even in space. And so you would have, whole planets that were, empires. You'd still have kingdoms. And so when we think about utopias, I think one of the things we need to be careful of is who's benefiting from this utopia, and whose biases are being reflected in utopia, and whose voices are not, and who's being left out of the conversation. Very often our utopias are, I think everyone's utopia is someone else's dystopia, depending on whose voice has been left out of the conversation.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, go ahead, please.
I mean, I think another, there's that phrase, something like good enough is the enemy of perfect. And I actually think that when it comes to utopia, not good enough can be the enemy of better. So like one of the things that I've gotten criticism from some people who are very into sort of anarchist political theory is kind of highlighting the aspects of what's happening in Rojava that are anarchist in nature. And they'll say, well, no, so the PYD, the dominant political party, has people, you know, who hold, they hold elections and they have power for a period of years or whatever. Like, that's not anarchist. This aspect's not anarchist. This aspect's not anarchist. And it's like, you're correct. Like, you can say that this is not as far along as you want, but like to my mind, what is utopian is kind of the attempt to dissolve more systems of hierarchy. And I think that when you have, I think that true, like theoretical utopian thinking can lead people to reject things which are not as far along as they think they need to be, can lead them to reject out of hand a system that's better because it's not better enough. Can lead them to drop out and say like, well, if this system does this and this, but it doesn't do this and this, then I'm not going to support it, and I'm not going to be a part of trying to make it happen because it's not where I want it to be. And I think that's kind of one of the toxic aspects of sort of utopian thinking, is when you let your theories about how things should be stop you from embracing something that is better than what is. Yeah.
So, I mean, that it's, oh, sorry. I think it's also super important that we don't neglect the fact that utopias should never be a static thing. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't be once we hit it, it's perfect, then we're just going to stop doing it. And I think that's what I loved about hearing about Rojava is when they had these little clatches after every decision. People would talk about it, what went wrong, what went right, how do we improve, how do we make sure that, if this didn't work for this person, how do we make sure that when we do it again next time it works. And so it's based on an idea that we are constantly evolving. We're constantly we're never going to hit perfect. We're never going to hit the plateau where everything just stops improving. And I think that is something that we don't often consider when we think about, in our imagination, when we think about utopias.
Yeah. I think that's a critical aspect of something that actually is utopian, is the constant improvement, that it's never going to be, you never finish with the utopia. You're never done. It's a process of building and improving and getting better. And I think kind of the most dystopian thing is the idea that things are where there'll always be, right? Like that was the most horrifying thing of Orwell's 1984, that this was like a permanent state that had finally been locked down, a way to stop change from ever occurring. And it's also like you can kind of see within our own system, our current system, the desire for that. And like Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, right? Like that was seen as, with the fall of the Soviet Union, seen as such like an optimistic vision, but it's really terrifying to imagine that like the way things were in the world in 1992 was like, we got it, we're done. That's horrifying when you really think about where things were in a lot of parts of the world and what happened after. It's a nightmare. But it's also like, that's kind of always, it's a necessary aspect of hierarchical power structure, that they will want things to stay the way they are. The people who are at the top of that structure will want things, and in the middle, will want things to stay the way they are forever. And it's the nature of utopia to say, no, we can always be improving. We can always be criticizing. And that doesn't mean, self-criticism doesn't mean that we're saying you're bad or that what you did was bad. It means that we're saying like, okay, we did this. How can we do better the next time? Because we can always do better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that leads to another question that I have about your story, Chinelo. Talking about sort of the idea of remembering how things were and moving forward from that. In the story, you use the perspective of Nezeret, who's an incredibly long-lived vampire, as a way to think about the importance of historical memory. And I'd like to talk to you both about the role of elders in these revised social formations. And Robert, you've touched on this in your podcast about Rojava, but I wonder if you could talk about that from the story perspective and also in these real life communities.
I'm sorry, you broke up there for a second.
Oh, sure, yeah. So I wondered if you might talk about the role of elders in these revised social formations. So in the story, there's the perspective of this vampire who holds this legacy memory. But I want to talk about the role of elders in these social formations.
Yeah, it was really interesting because there was both this attitude in Rojava of so there's this they have one of the kind of fundamental local governing unit is the local commune, and so like every neighborhood, usually 100 to 200 or so households will have a local commune where adults are all members of this local commune, and they elect co-presidents to represent that neighborhood at sort of like the district level, and then the city level, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of like the fundamental building block. And these communes have committees that are elected that kind of focus on specific problems. And I spent some time hanging out with what was called the social committee of a local commune in one city. And the social committee was made up of all these older women. And it was so there's local communes, and then there's women's communes, because there's this understanding that because of the kind of system of male dominance that's persisted for so long, that women need women-only spaces in order to practice with some of these direct democracy ideas, to like grow and kind of build themselves up. And they have veto power over the decisions made by any other institution that's like mixed gender. So like the all women, when it's of an issue that affects women directly. And so this particular local committee was made up of older women. My interpreter called them the mamas, which is like the grandmas. And they were like dealing with very kind of pragmatic local issues. So like there would be murders sometimes, and their job would be to reintegrate both families of the victim and the perpetrator back into society so that there wouldn't be a cycle of familial violence as a result of this. And it was just kind of seen by everyone in the area that these older women, these like grandmothers, were the best people to do this job, because both they had kind of life experience dealing with family clashes, because they had large families and had dealt with their own families, so it makes sense that they'd be good at this job. But also they're respected because everybody respects their grandma. Like it's not like a cop coming in who lives in like 45 minutes away, and you don't know this guy and he's telling you to stop doing something. It's your grandma and her friends being like, what are you doing right now? Like, this isn't okay. And that's just kind of a more effective way to deal with certain problems. So there was this kind of inherent respect for age and the perspective it gives you on certain things, which I found, it's kind of what you'd expect, right? Like that's how it's supposed to be. We're supposed to look to our elders for guidance in those things. What I found really interesting is that there was also this, it was a reciprocal sort of respect. It wasn't like this hierarchy of age, because when I talked to these older women about what had inspired them to like become real, because most of these women couldn't read, had never been educated, what had inspired them to take increasing roles in governing their own society was the fact that almost all of them had lost sons and nephews fighting against ISIS. The children that they had brought into the world had died fighting. And they said that like the sacrifice of our youth inspired us to do this, because we had two choices when our kids got killed. We could either spend the rest of our lives mourning, or we could recognize that they died for the chance to bring a new system into reality. And if that's the way we look at it, then it's our responsibility not to spend all of our time in grief. It's our responsibility to become a part of this and to make it work. And so I guess that was kind of the most interesting part of the age dynamic there I saw, was this reciprocal understanding of youth needs to listen to age because it has wisdom, and the old need to follow the young because they know where the future is. And I found that really one of the more inspiring things that I saw there.
And what I loved, I love that aspect of the society, and it's sort of reflective of what is common in many African communities, especially like in Nigeria and in the ethnic group that I belong to. What was once maybe a sense of shared respect sometimes can coalesce and crystallize into a gerontocracy, where it is the rule of the elder over the younger to the detriment of all. But if you can recognize that your elders or the people who have lived longer have these lived visceral experiences that you would never be able to have, but can tap into to, you know, push forward your own reform and your own growth. That I don't see how. I think that's the way that most societies have operated through time. The weird, that Western educated, industrialized. There's a, you know, there are other words in that, are actually anomalous in the way that it treats and reveres youth and sort of discards the elderly. So it's not really the way that most societies have operated. Most people recognize that if you've got the experience to live to a certain point in time, you are a repository of information, you're a repository of knowledge that should be accessed. I think there's a saying that if an elder dies, the library burns down. And I think many cultures recognize that, but it can be very difficult under a capitalist production-oriented society to keep that and to make that true, because what capitalism values is constant growth, constant productivity, and productivity as defined in these really, really narrow confines. And so one of the first things that I find really empowering is when, you know, when we start to break down hierarchies and we start to break down structures, one of the things that we need to look at is breaking down structure around, you know, who is valued over whom, and what does value mean. And so in the story, I took the easy route a little bit and personified it, but mostly because the idea that you would have someone who had seen or experienced the world before, and whose the respect that she was given is not one that she had to coerce, but one that was naturally given to somebody who is a beloved member of your family, was very, very important, because to me that showed that it was possible to have this society or societal structure that integrated age and the knowledge that came with age in a really respectful manner. So a situation that could have easily turned into, you know, dominance or oppression is turned into something that is a lot more communitarian, a lot more nurturing, and a lot more kind. And I think that that's something that we often don't see when we think about our societies of the future. We think about utopias. We don't think about kindness as a fundamental core value. So it was really nice to see that in Rojava. That is something that had been practicalized to the point where there are real human beings living this out. Once again, it keeps blowing my mind.
Yeah, it's I think the thing that always not surprised because but inspired me most over there was yeah, like the pragmatism of the system that they've developed. I've spent a lot of time around activist movements. I cover protests, you know, starting with Occupy and you know, Standing Rock and protests, you know, that we've had over the last couple of years since President Trump came into office. Like I've been to a lot of demonstrations, and I've spent a lot of time kind of listening to people within the activist community. And the people that I really gravitate towards and respect are the actual kind of on the ground community organizers, the people who on a very daily basis do things out in the world. But that's when you get online, those are not the loudest voices. The loudest voices are the people who have a very strong idea about how things should be, and who in a lot of cases haven't done much out in the real world. And it was very inspiring to see a system that there was no pretense to it. Like there were among members of the system some really strong ideological beliefs, a lot of people who were big believers in Abdullah Öcalan and some of his political theories. But most of the people I met knew very little about the theory behind what they were doing. What they knew was that this is a system that works, and it is a system that doesn't oppress me, and like I have control over my own life. And there was all of the structures that I saw within that system were very much designed around what an average person can not just grasp, but can meaningfully participate in. And, you know, there was no elevation of people beyond their area of possible competence, which I think is one of the most toxic things about our political system. The idea that you can have a president who is both expected to make calls on national defense and on healthcare, when it's like there's not a single person in this country or in this world who is competent in matters of military strategy, in epidemiology, in matters of like how to deal with social problems like homelessness, like nobody has that breadth of expertise. And the pragmatism of a system designed to make sure that people have absolute, or as close to absolute as is reasonably possible, autonomy over their own lives, the thing that they're competent to decide, and minimal control over things they're not competent to decide, including how their neighbors, 300 miles to the east live their lives. I think that was really inspiring to see.
I want to talk a little bit about imagination, and especially in communities where conditions are really tough. At our office at the Center for Science and the Imagination, we've been thinking a lot about imagination, how to define it, how to measure it, and how to understand how it's broadly applied. So I wonder if the two of you are uniquely qualified to talk about this. I wonder if you might talk about the role of imagination and foresight and futures thinking in a region that's embroiled in combat, or Chinelo, with your work in nonprofits and NGOs.
So I think that nothing gets done without imagination. Nothing gets done if you can't see the thing that in order to build something where there is nothing there already, you need to have the ability to see the thing you're building, or at least to envision what is beyond yourself. And I think I don't know that there's anything more powerful than that. I don't know that any kind of revolution or change or push for change, or even the concept of a self that is different from the self you are now and projected into the future is possible if you cannot imagine it. And I think that and that's where being able to imagine on top of someone else's dream and improving that it becomes so fundamentally important. For me, I think of it in terms of my own growth as a writer. When I started out, the worlds that were imagined for me did not contain people who looked like me, did not contain people who came from my background, could not imagine that someone like me could exist in those worlds. And so, when I started writing, I wrote those worlds. I did not think to write myself into my own imagined futures or my own imagined spaces. And so I think there's something about when authoritarianism there's it's not a coincidence that the most authoritarian systems cannot produce, art that is truly inspiring. I watch, if you've ever seen a propaganda film, you see how bland and boring and there's a real sense that, like, when you create these oppressive structures, you dampen something that is really important about what it means to be human. When you loosen these structures, you see a blossoming of just the way people think. And so there's nothing that an oppressive or repressive or authoritarian system fears more than someone who can imagine life without that system. And so there's a lot of, when I think of the way the church kind of, in some ways tries to consolidate its hegemony, or when white supremacy tries to consolidate its power, it does so by doing its best to limit the way that people can imagine their own futures. And it's surprisingly effective. If you can't think of a situation that's better than the situation you're in, you're gonna be stuck there for, for as long as, for forever, until you can think your way out of an oppressive structure. You cannot escape it. You can't even begin to make plans to escape it. And so for me, that's why imagination, I think, is so insanely valuable. That's why, to me, it is so precious. Even if I never write another word, the idea that I have the ability to imagine something beyond what I am stuck in is beyond measure. And a community like Rojava, or a community like the Homestead, one of the things that that was so important is that for the community in the Homestead, for instance, their inability to imagine a brutalist hierarchy that would try to exploit them, that would try to destroy them, could have been their weakness. So if a vampire like Nesseret, or if they didn't have access to that lived experience, that could have been the way that they would have, ended up being destroyed. I mean, we don't really know what happens to them, but the fact that you can't imagine something immediately limits you. And so the power of imagination is so important, because it allows you the freedom to go in any direction that you need to go, to grow, to improve, to become. And I don't know that there's any price you can pay or put on something like
that. Robert?
Yeah, without imagination, without being able to imagine a better future, you kind of cede the future to the imagination of others. And we've, in our present situation, we know what they're imagining. We can see it in the groups that contain, at this point, more than 100,000 Americans fantasizing about a second civil war. We know what these people who are marching in like armor and with weapons down American city streets with boogaloo patches, we know what they want. We know what their imagined future is, and it's a future in which they get to use violent force against the people who disagree with them, because that's fundamentally what they want. If we're not able to come up with, on the progressive side of things, an actual vision of the future, and not just sort of duct tape over the problems in our current society, not just like, oh, well, we can make healthcare better if we do this. Oh, well, we can make homelessness better if we do this. If we, like, not to say that those things aren't valuable and important, because I support iterative improvements. But if there's not a vision of a better and different future after the system that we currently reside in stops being functional, because it is increasingly non-functional for increasing segments of our society. If we can't present enough people with a vision of what comes next, then the people who already know what they want to come next are going to win. That's just the way it works. That's the only way it will ever work.
Yeah, somebody's going to determine the future. The future doesn't just happen by itself. It happens through the active efforts of a committed group of people. And if that group of people are the people for whom it is much more important that they oppress, they're the ones that are going to continue. I think Nigeria is a really great example of this, because we have, in many ways, systems that work really, really, really hard to dampen, to destroy, to silence imagination, and questioning. So these are systems that we've inherited from these are colonial systems. They were essentially brought in by, British colonialists and put in place to keep us from thinking about, or to habituate us into never questioning authority, for instance. So you have an education system, when I went through the Nigerian education system, where you would be punished if you asked a question. You would be punished if you suggested an improvement that an administrator didn't like. And you bake that into the system deep enough and long enough, by the time you've come out, you have a population that's pretty passive and pretty accepting of, well, if the person in charge says it, there's nothing I can do. The people in charge don't want you to imagine a future where they are no longer in charge. That is the most terrifying thing. It's something, it kind of harkens back to the dystopias I see on TV all the time. For whom are these systems dystopic? It's often, well, no one's in charge. No one's in charge, which means that if no one's in charge, everybody can just do whatever they want. We know that in actual real life, when systems fall apart, nobody seems to be in charge, somebody steps up. And those people that step up don't necessarily do so in a spirit of, I'm just going to take over and oppress everybody else. That's not necessarily how that's going to go. But if you can condition people's imagination to think that the only thing that will come out of an oppressive system is more oppression, then that's what we come to expect. We won't try for anything different. We won't try to think of building anything different. And Robert, you're right. These, the groups that we are, sort of up against, have their visions of the future mapped out. They wanted to take us back to a system where, people of color have no rights, for instance, or women have no rights. And they're pretty explicit about it. So unless we can come up with systems of our own and visions of our own that really can give people, that empower people, we cede the future to the most regressive members of of our society. We might as well just hand it to them right now. And it's not a future that's particularly sustainable. I mean, not if we take climate change into account. These are groups that are more than happy to raise the ground that they stand on, as long as they have a hill that is a little bit higher than everyone else's. So in that case, that's where I think there's an urgency to the imagination and to the imagination, the project of imagination today.
Yeah. We've got just a couple minutes left, so I just want to just build on this question, and I'm sorry for all the great questions that we haven't had a chance to get to in the Q&A. Can Rojava and other utopian experiments around the world start to catch on and blossom more broadly? And then, talking about our own sort of personal sort of self-efficacy around imagination, what can we do to imagine more and change our world, even if it's just sort of our immediate neighborhood?
I think projects like this, like Rojava, will catch on in other parts of the world as the systems that have governed those other parts of the world either collapse or fall apart in pieces, because that they have to. And that won't be the only thing that happens. There will also be other things that are tried that are, in my opinion, much worse and much more toxic and fundamentally terrifying in some ways. But as we see kind of state power in areas erode, and as we see outside forces push change upon the system that it can't handle without cracking, I do think that sort of new ideas will fill those cracks. And I think it's the job of everybody who kind of sees what's happening and sees where we are to try to inject as many of these of utopian ideas, of ideas with possibility, of ideas that focus on human empowerment and the dissolution of hierarchy. I think it's our responsibility to inject that as much as possible into these cracks, because that is going to determine what grows and kind of moss-like spreads over the corpse of the old world. So it's dependent upon all of us to do that now. Like, this is happening right this moment. So yeah, the best advice I can give anyone who wants to see a better world is to get out there, envision it, and try to spread that vision, and try to take direct action when you can in your community. I think that's part of what's so valuable about a lot of the mutual aid projects that have cropped up in the face of the government's failure to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think at this stage, most people who are participating in mutual aid projects don't see mutual aid as what it is, which is a fundamentally revolutionary activity. You know, mutual aid is the idea that we should not be dependent upon a hierarchical outside system, nor should our neighbors, that like we all have a radical responsibility for each other. But I think that the more people participate in projects like that, and the more they see them as the only real remedy to their problems, the more people will recognize, even if it's not at an intellectual level, at a gut level, the anti-authoritarian nature of these projects and the kind of revolutionary nature of these projects. And I think once you start thinking and acting that way, you hit a point where it's impossible to go back. So that's my hope for everyone here today.
Yeah.
I agree. I think that the real value is in not imagining the fall of capitalism in itself, but in imagining what can, like, seeing it as an opportunity of what can grow out of it when it's gone, because it will go. Nothing lasts forever. It's already falling apart, and it's balanced and teeters on such a thin razor's edge of exploitation, and enough people are already unhappy and unable, and even if we just, all we have to do is wait, in some cases, because the planet is going to demand of us some sort of movement and some sort of behavioral change. What that change is going to be is really up to us. But I think that if we can keep the failures of our current system in mind, we can keep from repeating it. And in some ways, that's sort of the symbol of Nesseret the vampire in the story, is that we, in order to build the thing that we want to see in these communitarian systems and these egalitarian systems, we do have to keep in mind how bad authoritarianism and hierarchy is. Like, it doesn't help us sort of imagine or romanticize some sort of medieval past, for instance, that, oh, I'm sure if we just all went back to living as peasants, everything's going to be great. I think we need to keep in front of us the idea that this is the inevitable conclusion to a journey that we started long ago, maybe with the Enlightenment, even further back than that, and we've seen it to its inevitable conclusion. There needs to be something new. There needs to be something better. And I think that if we can approach the coming age of collapse with hope and optimism, we can build upon its ashes something that is far, far more sustainable, something that is kinder, something that is more equitable. And we can keep doing that.
That's great. We've gone a little bit over time, but this has been amazing and incredibly inspiring. And as evidenced by all the questions in the chat, we could go much longer, but we can't, unfortunately. So thank you so much for your time and for your insights. Chinelo and Robert, can you let people know where to find you and follow your work?
So
no, please, Chinelo, sorry.
I can be found on Twitter is where I usually have my biggest presence. My handle is at Chinelo Onwualu. I also have a website, chineloonwalu.com. I help co-edit a magazine for queer people of color called Anathema, and it's anathemamag.com. So I can be found in any of those places, but Twitter is probably where you will see me doing the most.
And you can find my podcast, The Women's War, on the iHeartRadio network. It's on Spotify, all the different places you can find it. And we also have a website, thewomenswar.com, where we're slowly putting up the scripts for every episode. So that'll be just kind of free and available for anybody. And I'm also on Twitter at iWriteOK, but my Twitter's not very useful. You don't need to follow that. Just listen to the show. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for watching. Our next story for the Us and Flux series is a piece called A Room of One's Own by Tochi Onyebuchi. We'll publish that this Thursday, April 30th, and we'll follow up with a chat with Tochi and our colleague, Professor Michael G. Bennett, on Monday, May 4th. So you can find more information about those pieces, those events, and our center at our website, csi.asu.edu. You can follow us on social media at ImaginationASU. Until then, stay well. Thanks so much. And we'll see you again next time. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.